Hello, everybody. So first, yes, I'm French, but you should also know that I'm both a writer and a researcher, so I may do things slightly different than what you saw earlier. So basically, the fact that I'm a researcher means that I can't help myself to look at theories when I'm writing books or novels or video games. And I'm using narrative experiments as a way to validate my hypothetical theories, my hypothesis. So sometimes this is called research creation. Maybe you've heard of these words. And today I'm going to talk about a game that I worked on the last year, and it's called Moonlight Lovers, and it is an Otome game, and it is made by the French studio B-Move. When I was writing it, another issue than the one that I talked about in my thesis emerged, and this issue was about the representation of women and their place in society. So first of all, let me tell you that I'm not going to try and define feminism here, and I'm only giving you a working definition that I'm using as a reminder for myself on an everyday basis. So, and three names as references, you know. So feminism for me can be defined as a fight for equality, emphasizing on women's rights. And for me, it's very personal, and I know we don't always agree on definitions, but for me, feminism is also about having the choice to be who you want or need to be. The thing is that I have to define a bit more is what is an Otome game. So it's a kind of visual novel, and Kotaro Oshikoshi, who was the narrative designer on Virtue's Last Reward, defines a visual novel as a video game with an emphasis on narrative. So it's a very broad definition. And so to give you a rough idea, it's an interactive story which the player discovers mainly throughout dialogues, and it's the characters are represented visually on static backgrounds, and it's often using anime style. Visual novels are often, but not always, branching narrative. And the Otome games are specifically targeted toward women. The goal of the game is to develop a romantic relationship between a female character and a male character she has to choose. So if we look at a game structure, and this is a rough example just to give you an idea, often each answer influences the relationship between the player character and the non-player character. So you can gain or lose points. Since your aim is to date the character, you want him to like you. Often this means that you'll choose the answer that you think will make him like you the most. And sometimes there are a lot of character you can love, so the answer is embedded in several numerical systems, which means that the answer A, for example, can make you progress in one relationship and set you back in another. So this game system obviously allows a narrative designer to create subtle relationships and give freedom to the player to build her own persona in the game. And in some Otome games, there is also a class system to define the player character. But since the game is also about a girl choosing the right answer to please a male character, this raises some issues. So my question is, how can I write an Otome which will be played by young girls, often 15, 20 years maybe, without compelling them into gender norms. So that was my question when I began writing this game. And to answer this question, and this is where the researcher, comes back. To answer this question, I think it's important to take into account the context in which video games are played. So I'll give you a bit of information on the history of Otome game. The first Otome game seems to be Angélique, which was published in 1994. And the genre is born as a reaction to bishoujo games, which existed before. And bishoujo games are basically the same, but for boys, which means that they are love stories made for heterosexual boys. And Kim Aishin argues that both Otome and bishoujo have a common ancestor in the manga. Emily Taylor shows that they should be understood as part of the otaku culture in Japan. And then the genre spreads out its original cradle in Europe and in North America. Today it's still a niche market, but it's constantly growing, evolving. And Emily Taylor notices that while being created and published outside of Japan, the genres began to change. And for example, the player character is less and less a blank state. So having those elements of context in mind is very helpful to try to understand how Otome games are perceived. And there is no consensus among scholars, but there are a lot of theories that invite us, or at least me, to revise the first impression that I had that Otome games are a bit sexist or raised issues. Emily Taylor argues that bishoujo games are expressing a longing for men to control women. And this is a way to reaffirm the otaku masculinity. And the same male gaze that influences the bishoujo could be seen also in their feminine counterparts, that means Otome games. And Sarah Christina Ganson also thinks that Otome games reflect essentialist gender ideals and tend to train women as consumers in capitalist society. The women are, in fact, in most Otome games, confined within domestic space and encouraged to develop feminine activity links with beauty, for example, and they are encouraged to give gifts. But Ganson also notices that the player feel a very different way about the Otome. They appropriate the games, and they deflect those ideas of genders and consumer culture. So there are authors that think that the empowerment that is allowed by Otome game is not only due to the player's interpretation, but also by the games themselves. And Azuma and Gail Brace agree that, in fact, bishoujos, or the male counterpart, should not be seen as a plea for masculinity. On the contrary, Gail Brace shows that the player identifies with the women rather than the male player character, because the women express a lot of emotion, and he uses the sentence soulful bodies. And so Azuma shows that the aim of the bishoujo is getting emotional, and this is traditionally valued as a feminine characteristic. So since the bishoujo should not be understood within strict gender boundaries, I think it's the same for the Otome games. And Yeshin and Azagewa both argue that Otome games are a safe space for women to experiment with their fantasies, their desires, their identities. So all of this means that designing an Otome games demands to be aware of the gender issue raised by the genre, but also to keep the specificities of the genre without prejudices. So, writing a feminist Otome games meaning accepting certain ambiguities of the genre, I think, and feminism should be maybe regarded as a guideline rather than a principle that can be applied in just one way. So, today I don't have a perfect recipe for you that works every time, but I'm going to show you a series of examples and try to explain my design choices regarding feminism. A few things that you want to know first is that I'm a freelance writer and the game is not released yet. This means that I won't be able to give you as much details as I wanted to. And you should also know that I'm not the only one in the studio concerned about these issues, and we talked a lot about it with the creative director. So the story basically is about a young girl who lost her parents when she was a baby. And when she's turning 18, she discovered the mansion they owned. And now 6 vampires live in the lost building, and an incident occurs when she visits the place for the first time. So the player has to choose one vampire who will save her. This choice basically determines her crush, which means the player character, will come to love at the end, obviously, because it's an Otome game. So, first of all, I decided to give flesh to the player character. Of course, the cliché of the orphan was used, and there are a lot of clichés used. But I didn't want her to feel like a blank sheet. And to create identification, I mainly relied on memories that are easily shared. For example, being sick as a child, or arguing with friends, or learning lessons. I used feelings and sensation rather than detailed setting and precise time description. I rely a lot on the cooperation of the player, who is supposed to interpret the gaps on the text to make the adventure own. And if you know Umberto Eco, the gaps are what he talks about. Research again. However, a narrative voice is used to explore the inner life of the character, and it contrasts a lot with the dialogues, since I'm using past tense and a lot of figure of speech to describe the complexity of emotion. My aim is to encourage the player to reflect on her own feeling, and the challenge was to find the right balance between giving flesh to the character without imposing any views. So I wanted to create a strong character, but I didn't want to pressure the player into being always brave and heroic. So sometimes you don't cope with a situation like you wanted to, but that's okay, you know. And the numerical system is on hold, and you're not penalized by it. In the same line of thought, I didn't want the relationship with the crush to be unidimensional. Agreeing with him or pleading him or wanting to be with him at any cost isn't always the best option for him to fall in love with you. This means that the connection grows when the action of the player character are in line with the values the crush has. For example, one of them values courage and action, and another one values caution and reflection, and you have to align yourself with those values rather than always trying to please him. So a system of points is used, but I tried for each path, to be as interesting as possible, even if the relationship between the player character and the crush is not absolute love or perfect. There is room for interesting nuances, in the relationships. In some routes, and this is a small victory for me, I gave the choice to the player not to fall in love. And that was a big victory for me. Even if one character of the whole set is the center of the player's attention, I tried not to use the other one as props for him to exist. I wouldn't want, for example, women to be set in the background or to be seen as interchangeable, so I didn't create a secondary character that way. So, of course, because it's an Otome game, the player character can't interact as much with all the vampire once the crush is chosen, but at the same time, she can develop friendships and have interesting conversation outside the one with her crush. So each vampire has obviously his own personality, and that also means his own views and prejudices on women. And I choose to include sexist comments. But the player character notices those comments. And I didn't want to pressure the player in always answering those comments, so you can choose to ignore them and deal with them in your own way. And the numerical system is once again on hold, and you deal with that as you want to. For example, so the game doesn't address frontally the discriminations the women face every day, but there are situations where the question is raised. For example, I included an exchange about pregnancy, and the player can use this space to think about what she wants and express her feeling without any prejudices or without being feeling judged. So some of the questions resonate with feminism in this game, but it's not the main focus because it's an Otome game. For example, this is not obvious here, but there are room for question about other type of sexualities than heterosexuality. And a lot of players playing Otome game look forward for the sex scene, but there are more and more visual novels about love without them. So I made sure that the scene was either very light, not crude, or completely optional. And I didn't want the player to be surprised, so the text clearly states when it's added that way. The type of representation that I chose was realistic but centered on emotion rather than accurate description. The aim of this scene was first and foremost to validate the desires a woman has. So contrary to contemporary fiction in general, I did not push the text towards speaking about feelings and love, but more about physical desire. Another issue was that in contemporary fiction, women are often described as passive, and I tried not to avoid that, but rather to put passivity as a choice to be taken amongst others. So the thing is, I didn't want to impose a right way to be with someone. And the diversity of the situation also led me to write about the failures and the awkwardness of those moments. Another question linked with sexuality that emerged was the fact that in popular culture, sex is the bites of vampire is often linked with sexuality. And those moments vary a lot according to the vampire you choose, but I use them as a way to give power to the woman, because most of the time in contemporary fiction, the woman is once again passive while the vampire bites her, but here I wanted her to have the power to feed the vampire. So most of the time, the blood is given voluntarily. And when it's not, I was very careful not to embellish the experience, which means that there is a scene treated like a memory of a rape, but I was very careful not to oblige the player to experience it, and including a possibility to back away from the memory. So my concerns about the role given to the female protagonist influence the way that I established a relationship with the male character and some parts of the story, but also how I designed the narrative structure. Since for me feminism is about empowerment, I try to encourage the player to think outside of the box and to trust their own skills, which means that exploration is rewarded. Often, if the player doesn't follow what the text says explicitly, but rather tries to find another way to find the information, then she has a bonus. For example, some points in the gaze system or a completely optional narrative scene. So feminism is about choice for me, and the visual novel seems to be a very interesting genre to encourage the player to experience different identities and different ways to be with someone they love. So in narrative design, this means including as much choices as possible, even if we all know here that not all of them create an alternative storyline. And to conclude those ideas, I decided to use an image of the end of Doki Doki Literature Club, and it's a visual novel that I'm sure you've played or you have on your wish list. The agency of the player here is denied since she has only one choice, and I thought it was a good way to express the fact that writing a feminist otome is not only possible but also necessary, in the fact that it doesn't mean not writing a love story or revolutionize the genre or talking only about the issue women encounter on a daily basis. I think it only means being aware of the cultural impact of what we are writing and trying very, very hard not to impose views and experiences as the right ones. Thank you.